Western Ukraine entered March 1944 in the middle of the Dnieper Carpathian campaign, a sequence of Soviet offensives intended to break Army Group South, cut German communications in Galicia, and reopen strategic routes toward Lviv, the Carpathians, and the Vistula Basin. The First Ukrainian Front, commanded by Nikolai Vatutin until he was mortally wounded in March and then overseen by Georgy Zhukov, was the principal Soviet formation in this sector, coordinating multiple field armies, tank armies, artillery corps, and air support for the Proskurov-Chernivtsi operation. Its task was to drive between the German 1st and 4th Panzer armies, isolate their groupings, and seize key rail junctions that sustained the German front in Galicia and Volhynia. Ternopil, known in German military documents as Tarnopol, lay on the Seret River at the intersection of east-west and north-south rail and road corridors. Lines linked it with Lviv to the west and Proskurov, Khmelnytskyi, and Odessa to the east and south. Additional spurs served Brody and Chortkiv. In 1944, the town's civilian population is commonly cited around 35,000, though wartime displacements meant numbers fluctuated. To Soviet staff officers, Ternopil was a communications node and a bridgehead on the approach to Lviv. To the German command, it was one of several points whose retention might slow operational collapse while mobile formations regrouped. Under pressure across a wide front, Adolf Hitler employed the fester Platz concept, ordering selected cities, ports, or bridgeheads to be held as fortresses regardless of operational setbacks. Such designations aimed to anchor a retreating front, tie down enemy forces in siege operations, and protect junctions critical for rail evacuation and reinforcement. Ternopil became the first of these in the First Ukrainian Front's path. On March 10, 1944, the city was declared a stronghold to be held to the last man, despite lacking permanent fortifications, natural barriers, or even an airstrip for regular supply drops. The order created a political and psychological imperative that overrode local assessments of the terrain's defensive value. The timing reflected Soviet gains earlier that month. From March 4th, the First Ukrainian Front opened the Proskurov-Chernivtsi offensive, striking through weak seams in the German 13th Army Corps sector, and forcing withdrawals by elements of 4th Panzer Army. Soviet armor exploited breaches to the operational depth, widening gaps and overrunning artillery positions that had anchored the German winter line. These movements set conditions for encirclement battles in western Ukraine and threatened to split Army Group South, compelling the German High Command to commit scarce reserves. Local German command arrangements in and around Ternopil were fluid in early 1944, with ad hoc units and rear area elements funneled into the city as the front approached. On January 22nd, General Major Egon von Neindorf was appointed garrison commander. His mission hardened after the fortress decree: organize the heterogeneous forces in the urban area, ration ammunition and food, and prepare for siege under the expectation that relief would be mounted from the west. By Soviet counts and German internal estimates, roughly 4,600 men formed the core of the garrison by late March, including Army infantry, police units, Luftwaffe flak detachments, and service troops gathered into battle groups. On the Soviet side, the encirclement task around Ternopil fell primarily to formations of 60th Army within the First Ukrainian Front. That army, which had fought at Voronezh, Kursk, and Kiev, had experience in combined arms assaults on urban objectives and in establishing artillery belts to seal pockets. Soviet planning emphasized rapid isolation rather than immediate storming, seize the high ground dominating approaches, cut the railway lines, interdict roads with anti-tank zones, and bring forward medium and heavy artillery to suppress strong points while sappers prepared breaches. Air units were tasked to disrupt any German attempt to re-establish overland contact. The Fortress Directive intersected with German operational problems outside the city. As the Proskurov-Chernivtsi offensive progressed, large elements of 1st Panzer Army were threatened with encirclement around Kamenets-Podilsky. To address this, Berlin authorized a rare transfer of armored reserves from France, 2 SS Panzer Corps with 9th and 10th SS Panzer divisions. Their principal assignment was to break open the Kamenets-Podolsky pocket. Only afterward could they assist attempts to reach Ternopil. The sequence mattered. It meant the garrison's expectation of swift relief depended on higher-level priorities that placed an entire field army's survival above a single fortress. Meanwhile, German units available nearer to Ternopil were thinly spread and in varying states of refit. The 8th Panzer Division, reconstituting near Brody, formed Kampfgruppe Friebe, an armored battle group intended for relief thrusts once the corridor narrowed. Other army formations were tasked to hold line segments against Soviet advances that threatened to turn tactical withdrawals into broader routes. The emphasis on mobile counterattacks contrasted with the immobile fortress order in the city, producing a dual-track approach: maneuver outside, static defense inside. Civilians in Ternopil entered March with limited options. Evacuation capacity by rail declined as Soviet artillery interdicted tracks and bridges. Those who stayed, Ukrainian and Polish residents, municipal workers, and the remaining non-combatant population, after prior deportations and wartime violence, faced requisitioning by the garrison, curfews, and the prospect of artillery fire once siege lines closed. Soviet staff memoranda treated the city primarily as a tactical objective, whose capture would hasten the fall of German positions in Galicia. German administrative orders prioritized holding depots, hospitals, and command posts within urban blocks, placing civilians and military assets in the same space. By the third week of March, both sides had aligned intentions with resources. The Soviet plan sought to seal Ternopil quickly and at minimal cost by cutting its lifelines before launching set-piece assaults. The German plan accepted isolation as a risk and relied on a timed relief from the west to extract the garrison or at least re-establish a corridor for supply. This divergence, encircle first versus hold and await rescue, defined the city's fate. When the pocket formed, each subsequent decision would be constrained by the logic established here: Soviet artillery and barrier lines tightening the ring, a German garrison ordered not to yield ground, and mobile groups outside the city calculating whether relief there justified the armor diverted from larger operational crises. The operation's opening phase began in the first half of March 1944, when the 1st Ukrainian Front extended its bridgeheads and pushed mobile groups west of the Seret. Staff work formalized a sequence: isolate Tarnopol on the rail net, interdict the road grid, and only then apply urban assault tactics. Forward detachments of rifle divisions advanced in echelons behind reconnaissance companies and engineers, marking belts for minefields and registering artillery on crossings north and south of the town. Air liaison officers from 2nd Air Army established radio schedules for daylight strikes against marshalling yards and bridges, with night harassment flights to slow any German withdrawal or reinforcement. The emphasis was on tempo rather than mass. A compact investment promised fewer casualties than a block-by-block fight undertaken before the city was sealed. German command relationships clarified in parallel. Army Group South entrusted the sector to 1st Panzer Army, whose headquarters was managing wider encirclement risks between the Zbruch and Dniester. The Tarnopol garrison reported to General Major Egon von Neindorf for all fortress matters, but rear area units and transit elements moving through Galicia remained under their parent corps. The arrangement created 2 calendars: the fortress timetable, which assumed a hold pending relief, and the field army timetable, which prioritized mobile operations to extract formations threatened farther south. Signals traffic reflects this duality. Fortress staff requested additional anti-tank guns, medical supplies, and demolition stores for inner-city barriers. Corps staff queried road states west of the city to stage armor for counter-thrusts toward Brody and Zboriv. Initial contact lines formed on the approaches rather than at the city limits. Soviet rifle regiments pressed into villages on the eastern and southeastern arcs, establishing outposts on ridge spurs that overlooked the Seret bends. Artillery groups moved into pre-surveyed positions with a mix of 76mm field guns, 122mm howitzers, and a smaller number of 152mm pieces for counter-battery and strongpoint work. Mortar battalions were tasked to sustain continuous fire during relief attempts. The goal was to degrade German lateral movement. By targeting choke points, rail switches, culverts, and embankments, Soviet gunners forced the garrison to commit repairs under observation or accept progressive isolation. Inside Tarnopol, the garrison converted public buildings into command and supply nodes. The town hall, schools, and warehouses became sector headquarters, dressing stations, and ration stores. An inner defensive ring exploited masonry blocks on either side of the river loops. A secondary ring incorporated churchyards, tram depots, and rail sheds. Infantry platoons were reinforced with machine guns in cellar loopholes and sandbagged windows. Luftwaffe flak detachments sighted 20mm and 37mm guns for dual roles against aircraft and street targets. Engineers prepared road craters and rails driven into intersections to obstruct armor. Ammunition control officers consolidated stocks from disparate units into central dumps to avoid a mismatch where one sector might exhaust rifle cartridges while another held surplus. Civil administration intersected with military requirements from the first days. Evacuation orders covered selected municipal employees and patients from hospitals, but train capacity diminished when artillery interdicted the lines to the west. Civilians who remained were directed to cellars during bombardments and, in some districts, organized for debris clearance to keep communication routes open between strongpoints. Food distribution shifted to ration kitchens managed under garrison oversight. The opening phase thus blended military preparations with emergency municipal management. Neither could be cleanly separated from the other once the siege measures accelerated. On the approaches, German outposts fought delaying actions rather than positional battles. Company and battalion-sized rear guards from army units rotating through the area contested crossroads for hours, then withdrew under cover of darkness to prearranged demolitions. Bridges judged impossible to hold for more than a day were mined. Culverts on side roads were collapsed to channel Soviet columns into kill zones where anti-tank guns had fields of fire. These measures did not intend to defeat a front-level offensive. They aimed to conserve ammunition and manpower while aligning the perimeter with the fortress plan. As weather alternated between thaw and freeze, logistics shaped operations. Soviet truck columns struggled on secondary roads, and staff prioritized bridging equipment for small watercourses that could stall artillery tractors. Where the ground allowed, narrow-gauge rails were extended to forward ammunition points to reduce turnaround times. On the German side, fuel convoys used night movement and civilian carts to supplement loads to the city. The garrison cataloged available fuel for generators and vehicles, assigning strict priorities. Medical facilities, radio stations, and command posts received first allotments. Mobile reserves inside the city received the remainder for short-timed counterattacks should Soviet infantry breach an outer block. Commanders on both sides issued guidance about fires within the urban area. Soviet artillery directives emphasized conservation during the investment and concentration during breaching. Suppress strong points with observed fire, avoid area bombardment until sectors were identified for entry, and reserve heavy calibers for interlocking fields of fire or reinforce stone structures. German orders stressed fire discipline to avoid premature disclosure of weapon locations. Machine guns were to fire short, registered bursts. Mortars were to relocate after limited missions. Flak guns used as anti-personnel weapons were to shift positions nightly. By the third week of March, the investment had taken shape. Soviet advance guards reported reaching the rail west of Tarnopol at several points, with patrols cutting telegraph lines and emplacing mines on verges where relief thrusts might form. Reconnaissance noted concentrations of German vehicles and armor forming near Brody and Zboriv, suggesting preparations for counteraction. In the city, the garrison closed its outer checkpoints and reorganized sectors to account for depleted outposts. Radio messages shifted tone from requests for construction timber to calls for additional medical dressings and illumination flares for night fighting. The opening phase concluded as both sides tested the perimeter without committing maximum force. Soviet commanders judged that the ring was sufficiently tight to begin systematic reduction, but held back from immediate storm assaults to observe German patterns of movement and locate reserves. German headquarters outside the city refined routes for relief along roads that could support tanks and recovery vehicles, while the fortress staff finalized demolitions tables for bridges and river crossings inside Tarnopol. The outcome of these preparatory choices would determine the tempo of the following weeks, whether an external thrust could meet an internal breakout, or whether the city would shift directly from investment to attrition under a closed siege. Strategic aims diverged sharply once Tarnopol was designated a fortress. Soviet planning placed the city within the Proskurov Chernivtsi operation timeline, not as an isolated target, but as a relay node whose capture would disrupt the German rail spine from Lviv to the Dniester basin. Headquarters of 1st Ukrainian Front set a two-tier objective set for 60th Army. First, encircle and neutralize Tarnopol to prevent it from anchoring a new German line. Second, hold a blocking perimeter to absorb any relief thrusts, while main forces continued west toward Brody and the Lviv approaches. Artillery and engineer assets were assigned with densities typical of late war doctrine, 100 to 140 tubes per kilometer on assault sectors at culmination, with initial investment relying on fewer guns used for interdiction and counter-battery. Air support from 2nd Air Army prioritized bridges, marshalling yards, and road choke points, with fighter sweeps scheduled to coincide with known German convoy times. German objectives reflected both the fortress order and the crisis around Kamenets-Podilsky. For the garrison, the directive was explicit: hold Tarnopol as a fester Platz, deny the Seret crossings and rail junctions, and retain a lodgment from which to reconstitute lateral communications if the mobile battle revived. For field formations outside the city, the planning horizon was narrower. Army and Corps headquarters intended to stage armor near Brody and Zborev, probe eastward along roads that could carry tanks and recovery vehicles, and open a corridor wide enough to pass fuel, medical teams, and ammunition into the city. Relief planning allocated timed thrusts by Kampfgruppen, built around available Panthers, Panzerfuhrls, Stugis, and self-propelled flak, supported by motorized infantry and pioneer companies for mine clearance. On the Soviet side, supply estimates drove sequencing. Staff planners calculated ammunition expenditure for a 10 to 14-day investment and reduction cycle, with daily allocations of 76 mm specs or 122 mm shells set to maintain interdiction fire without exhausting reserves needed for deliberate assaults. Bridging parks were earmarked for the smaller tributaries feeding the Seret, since even minor water obstacles could delay the movement of 152 mm guns and rocket launcher battalions. Fuel columns were tasked to deliver forward under night movement, with turnaround targets expressed in hours rather than days. Signal regiments expanded wire nets behind the forming ring, using buried cable where feasible to reduce vulnerability to counter-battery strikes. German logistics inside Tarnopol were defined by inventory and rationing rather than replenishment. Quartermasters established central dumps for small arms ammunition, mortar rounds, and anti-tank mines, with issue tables that favored sectors covering likely breach points on the straight avenues and open squares. Food stocks were converted to ration scales intended to last 3 to 4 weeks at reduced caloric levels. Medical supplies were triaged. Morphine, bandages, and plasma were reserved for surgical stations sited in basements with reinforced ceilings. Fuel was the most constrained commodity. Generator hours were scheduled to power radio nets, operating tables, and short-range movements of reserve squads between sectors. Doctrinal guidance framed how each side intended to fight for the city. Soviet instructions emphasized the standard progression of encircle, divide, and reduce. Sappers would clear lanes through outer obstacles, infantry would seize footholds at road junctions and river bends, and artillery would suppress identified strong points with observed fire rather than area bombardments until assault groups were in position. German urban defense doctrine stressed depth and elasticity within the street grid. Strong points were to be sited in pairs to create interlocking fields of fire. Machine guns were to fire oblique across streets. PA-40s and captured Soviet guns were to be held under cover until tanks presented flanks at intersections. Flak 20 mm and 37 mm pieces would be used at ground level to break up infantry rushes. Intelligence estimates on both sides were imperfect. Soviet reconnaissance by patrol and aerial photography produced accurate sketches of rail yards, warehouses, and major buildings, but undercounted the number of automatic weapons positioned in cellars and behind masonry. German estimates of Soviet artillery strength outside the city varied by day as batteries displaced, and optimism in some reports overstated the effect of demolitions on bridges and culverts. Radio intercept sections on both sides provided timing cues rather than deep order of battle insight. Traffic peaks suggested assembly and relief windows, but did not reveal the full composition of the opposing force. Preparations tracked these assessments. Soviet engineers stockpiled Bangalore torpedoes, satchel charges, and fascines for trench and crater crossing, and cut pioneer teams were paired with flamethrower sections for bunker reduction. Assault detachments were structured with a predictable mix of submachine gunners, riflemen, light machine guns, and sappers, each with assigned frontage and time on task. German engineers, constrained by materials, emphasized expedience. Doors reinforced with rails, stairwells blocked with sand and brick, and loopholes knocked through party walls to allow intra-block movement shielded from direct fire. Demolition tables covered internal bridges and riverbank ramps to be fired only when relief attempts failed to reach specified checkpoints. Miscalculations were built into the plans. Soviet staff assumed that once the ring closed, the garrison would conserve ammunition and avoid large-scale sorties, allowing a methodical reduction. The fortress order encouraged the opposite, short, violent counterattacks, to retake firing positions and delay sapping operations. German relief timetables were predicated on armor availability after the Kamenets-Podilsky breakout. Any delay in that larger operation pushed Tarnopol resupply beyond the endurance of rationed stocks. Both sides recognized the weather risk. Thaw conditions could immobilize heavy vehicles, and freeze could return without warning, shifting road priorities overnight. Propaganda lines were integrated but secondary to operational aims. German communiques highlighted the fortress designation to signal will and reassure rear areas that the retreat could be stabilized at selected points. Soviet newspapers framed the investment as a step toward the liberation of western Ukrainian towns and the reopening of communications to the Carpathian foreland. Neither message altered the allocations of shells, fuel, or bridging equipment, but both shaped expectations among troops and civilians about duration and outcome. Command postures reflected the balance between doctrine and circumstance. Soviet commanders retained authority to switch from investment to assault when reconnaissance identified a sector where artillery and sappers had created a scalable breach. German commanders inside the city kept a small mobile reserve intended for counterstrokes measured in blocks rather than kilometers, accepting that each commitment would consume irreplaceable ammunition. Outside the city, German Corps staff adjusted relief routes to roads bearing bridges that could take 30-ton loads, cataloging ford sites, but treating them as last resort options for tanks. By the end of the planning phase, both frameworks were internally coherent and mutually antagonistic. One system relied on time, density of fire, and controlled expenditure to force a contained collapse. The other relied on fortification, economy of force, and the timed arrival of external armor to break the siege logic. The gap between these assumptions defined the risks of the coming engagements. Contacts solidified in the last week of March 1944, when Soviet forward detachments of 60th Army completed the arc east and south of Tarnopol and shifted from reconnaissance in force to deliberate probes. On 23 to 24th March, rifle battalions moved onto the rail lines west of the town at several points, severing telegraph circuits and lifting rails near cuttings where repair under fire was difficult. Engineer companies emplaced mixed mine fields on verges leading into the city and marked lanes for their own assault troops. Medium artillery registered the marshalling yard and the Seret crossings, while heavier guns took counter-battery tasks against German pieces sited behind masonry at the rail sheds and near the tram depot. The initial exchanges were limited in duration, 10 to 15-minute concentrations intended to test responses and fix weapon locations, followed by infantry pushes to the next row of outbuildings. German outposts outside the built-up area yielded ground by design, Platoon and company-sized screens from army and police units withdrew on prearranged signals to the inner ring once Soviet patrols established enfilade from ridge spurs north of the river loops. Demolitions dropped short-span bridges on feeder roads, and road craters were opened with charges to channel vehicles toward intersections, where anti-tank guns had measured ranges. Inside the town, sector commanders redistributed automatic weapons to cover straight street vistas and squares. 2 20mm flak guns were shifted per night on average to avoid patterning. Fire discipline remained strict. Machine guns fired short-registered bursts from cellars and then displaced through party wall passages. Mortars fired from courtyards with overhead cover, leaving only spent casings and quickly erased footprints. By 26th March, the ring had practical continuity. Soviet reports logged repeated cuts on the Lviv line west of Tarnopol and interdiction fire on the Brody Road. Cavalry recon elements worked behind the investment to intercept couriers and small vehicles attempting to shuttle between the city and field headquarters. The first serious infantry clashes inside the industrial fringe followed. Assault groups of 20 to 30 men, organized around submachine guns and light machine guns with 2 sapper teams, advanced along rear walls of warehouses north of the main rail yard. Their task was to secure footholds without overextension. Several sheds changed hands twice in one day, as German counter-squads used laddered grenades and short controlled rushes from lateral alleys to retake firing points. Casualty figures for these actions remained in the dozens per side, but ammunition expenditure rates, especially German hand grenades and 81mm mortar rounds, rose beyond peacetime stock assumptions, prompting stricter issue tables within the garrison. Artillery duels intensified as both sides refined target lists. Soviet batteries used sound ranging and observation from upper floors of farmhouses on the approaches to registered German mortars. German observers answered with prearranged defensive fires, keyed to corner buildings and roof lines. A single 152mm concentration on 27th of March collapsed 2 spans of the rail overpass, closing one of the last direct vehicle paths between northern and southern sectors. German engineers countered with a timber and rail decking under darkness, rated for carts and light trucks, but not tanks. The stopgap preserved internal redistribution of ammunition, but narrowed options for mobile reserves to move between sectors. The first armored probes occurred on 28-29 March when Soviet tanks, generally in pairs or threes, tested street approaches screened by infantry. They halted at pre-selected corners to fire high explosive into suspected strongpoints and then reversed, avoiding deeper entry where flanking fire could be arranged. German gunners held their anti-tank weapons for oblique shots at short range. One PAK-40 sighted behind a collapsed facade disabled 2 tanks at under 300 meters, but was then suppressed by direct fire howitzers using smoke and high explosive. The exchange clarified patterns that would persist. Armor would not push past the first major intersection without confirmed suppression. Defenders would reserve guns for high-probability angles rather than engage at long range. Civilian movement during these first engagements shifted from ad hoc to regulated. The garrison ordered residents to use designated cellars during daylight bombardments and authorized short windows for water and fuel collection. Municipal workers, including a number of women and adolescents, were organized for debris clearance after concentrations to keep 2 interior, east-west, and north-south routes open for stretcher movement and ration carts. On the Soviet side, liaison officers met local inhabitants at the perimeter villages to gather information on building basements, party wall thicknesses, and stairwell locations. These reports shaped target folders and reduced the need for blind fires that could waste ammunition. Relief preparations outside Tarnopol began to manifest in the contact zone. Reconnaissance noted armored vehicles assembling near Zboriv and Brody, and increased radio activity consistent with a Kampfgruppe, forming around available tanks and assault guns. Soviet artillery responded with interdiction on probable forming up areas and deep cuts along road verges using time-fused airbursts to hinder night movement. At the same time, 60th Army kept most heavy batteries on call rather than locked to the urban fires, anticipating that the first serious relief attempt would require a rapid shift from siege to anti-armor missions on the Western Arc. Within the fortress, rationing tightened. Bread and tinned meat issuance for combat troops was trimmed, and hot meals were centralized to reduce fuel use and smoke signatures. Medical stations reported an uptick in blast injuries from falling masonry and splinters rather than gunshot wounds, reflecting the artillery's prevalence in the opening phase. Surgical tables were concentrated in basements with vaulting. Generator hours were allocated to lighting and sterilization cycles. The garrison recorded ammunition totals sector by sector at dusk each day and shifted machine gun belts and mortar bombs to threatened zones under darkness. The end of March brought the first limited Soviet penetrations beyond the industrial fringe into contiguous housing blocks along the Seret Loop. Assault groups used Bangalore torpedoes to open wire obstacles and moved by internal courtyards rather than streets. German counters were short and violent, typically launched by a reserve squad of 10 to 12 men with 2 light machine guns and a flamethrower, aiming to restore the pre-dawn line and then break contact before artillery could respond. These actions incurred casualties that neither side considered decisive but forced adjustments. Soviet commanders increased the density of smoke rounds during entry, and German platoon leaders conserved flamethrower fuel for breaches rather than deterrent fires. By 1st April, the pattern of first engagements was clear. The city was tactically encircled, internal strong points had been tested but not reduced, and both commands had refined their methods. The Soviet ring could tighten with more artillery and engineer assets as roads dried. The garrison had demonstrated the ability to contest every block at short notice, but at the cost of munitions that could not be replaced in quantity until a relief corridor opened. Outside the perimeter, armored regrouping pointed to a near-term attempt to break in from the west, while inside the town, demolition teams finalized charges on inner bridges to be fired if penetration threatened sector coherence. The early clashes did not settle the siege. They established the geometry, where fires converged, where movement remained possible, and where the next phase would fall hardest, when both sides committed larger forces. Escalation began as March turned to April, when both commands committed larger forces to either compress or reopen the ring. Soviet artillery groups increased tube density on the western and northwestern arcs, bringing additional 122mm SEST on 152mm howitzers forward as roads stiffened overnight and softened again by afternoon thaw. Fire plans shifted from short registrations to layered programs. Interdiction on the Brody and Zborov approaches, counter-battery against mortars inside the town, and timed concentrations to mask sapper work at identified breach points. Rocket launcher battalions were held for night salvos to disrupt relief assembly areas rather than for urban demolition, conserving heavy ammunition for when the perimeter would be tested by armor. German staff outside Tarnopol consolidated a relief force built around elements of 8th Panzer Division and attached assault guns, with motorized infantry and pioneers for mine clearance. The available strength fluctuated with breakdowns and recovery rates, but the first thrusts in early April deployed on the order of several dozen armored vehicles in grouped waves rather than in a single mass. The chosen axes followed roads that could carry 30-ton loads and had bridges that engineers judged repairable within hours if cut. The terrain imposed further constraints. Where fields and verges remained waterlogged, tanks were forced into column on raised causeways, predictable to observers and exposed to pre-sighted fire. Inside the city, the garrison expanded depth rather than breadth. Strong points were multiplied in pairs to create overlapping fire across adjacent blocks, and communication trenches were cut through gardens and courtyards to allow movement without using streets. Reserve squads were trimmed to the minimum required to deliver short counterattacks of 1 or 2 blocks. The remainder were assigned to man fixed weapons and maintain ammunition discipline. Medical stations reported rising proportions of crush and blast injuries as heavier artillery entered the fires plan. Each successful clearance of a collapsed stairwell or corridor required repeated exposure to secondary collapses, consuming time and stretchers. The first relief attempt reached within several kilometers of the western perimeter. Soviet forward observers counted columns by dust and engine noise where the road ran on higher ground. Anti-tank belts had been arranged in layers, guns at 600, 800 meters for first engagement, secondary positions at 300 to 400 meters on oblique angles from side lanes, and mobile teams with anti-tank rifles and mines to finish damaged vehicles. When the lead elements made contact, Soviet guns focused on the first 2 or 3 vehicles to block the road, followed by targeted fire on recovery vehicles. German pioneers attempted hasty lane clearance but found that verges would not hold the weight of tanks moving to bypass. The fight lasted hours rather than minutes, with both sides reporting equipment losses and damaged vehicles left in the kill zone until night. Artillery on both sides deepened the crisis. Soviet batteries, alerted by the relief push, shifted several groups from urban suppression to anti-armor support, lengthening the time required to resume methodical reduction of inner strongpoints. German artillery and mortars within Tarnopol fired defensive barrages to enable brief sorties by garrison squads to retake observation points on upper floors that Soviet patrols had occupied during the morning. Ammunition use accelerated beyond earlier ration plans. By the second week of April, the garrison's mortar stocks had fallen to levels that forced substitution with rifle grenades and scarce heavy machine gun belts. Soviet logs recorded higher issues of smoke to cover redeployments between street sectors after counterattacks. Weather remained a command problem. Night freezes allowed movement of heavy guns and fuel trucks. Midday thaw turned shoulders to mud that trapped recovery vehicles. Commanders had to synchronize operations with a narrow window of firm ground. Relief thrusts timed for pre-dawn often found the last kilometers still soft enough to slow mine clearance. Soviet planners exploited this by scheduling air and artillery interdiction when columns were most compressed, then resuming urban fires after relief traffic dispersed or halted. Civilians experienced the escalation as a reduction in movement and services. Water points were restricted to fewer locations to reduce exposure to shelling. Bread distribution shifted to irregular hours to avoid patterns that could be targeted. Cellars filled beyond intended capacity, and sanitation deteriorated. Casualty handling procedures adapted. Temporary burial parties operated at night in courtyards or along interior lanes. Identification was recorded where possible, but repeated shelling reopened shallow graves. On the Soviet side of the ring, displaced residents from outlying villages were screened, questioned for information about building interiors, and directed along controlled routes to rear areas. Civil authorities documented property damage for post-operation reporting, a task that nonetheless could not influence immediate allocation of artillery or engineer assets. Command and control frictions grew with loss of infrastructure. German radio nets suffered from damaged antennas and generator shortages. Alternate sets with pedal power or improvised batteries extended range but supported fewer channels. Runners increasingly carried messages along party wall passages, increasing delays between sectors. Soviet wire nets, buried where time allowed, still experienced frequent cuts from counter-battery fire and required continuous repair by line crews working under shell bursts. Both sides imposed stricter message discipline, limiting traffic to essential fire orders and sector status reports. Losses among junior leaders changed the tempo of local fights. Platoon and company commanders in street sectors were exposed to observation and sniper fire when directing machine guns or calling for defensive fires from rooftops. Replacement officers and senior non-commissioned officers rotated into command roles, competent in doctrine but unfamiliar with the specific geometry of each block. Soviet battalions rotated assault companies to maintain tempo, but each handover lost hours of local knowledge about stairwells, cellar networks, and firing slits. German sectors that relied on a single veteran mortar crew or an experienced anti-tank gunner found performance dropped when those specialists were wounded or killed. Political guidance continued to reinforce operational choices without altering material constraints. The fortress order remained in force and was repeated to the garrison with references to the wider front, while Soviet newspapers framed Tarnopol as one of several urban objectives whose reduction would open the approaches to Lviv. For troops, the messages underscored endurance more than timelines. In practice, decisions turned on maps of ammunition, stocks, fuel hours, and the road state reports that arrived each evening from relief staging areas. By mid-April, the crisis phase had a measurable profile. Relief had approached close enough to force Soviet artillery to divert from urban suppression. The garrison had maintained internal coherence, but at the price of high expenditure and attrition among its mobile squads. Civilians had fewer safe hours above cellars, and both commands recalculated endurance. German staffs outside the city reviewed whether another attempt with similar means could yield a different result without additional armor and bridging. Soviet staffs compared the cost of storming with reinforced assault groups against continuing investment and interdiction for several more days. The siege no longer resembled the first probes of late March. It had become a contest of throughput, ground that would carry steel, and the capacity of both sides to time their commitments to the few hours each day when the roads were firm enough to move guns and the airfields dry enough to fly sustained sorties. The peak came in the second week of April, when siege and relief reached their maximum intensity within the same 72 hours. On 11 to 12 April, a German battle group assembled around armor from 8th Panzer Division and attached assault guns pushed from the Brody-Zborov axis along the firmest roadbeds. Engineers preceded the column, probing verges with Bangalore torpedoes and marking lanes across mixed mine belts laid in the first days of the encirclement. The approach compressed into a single file where waterlogged shoulders made bypass impossible. Soviet observers on slight rises west of the city tracked movement by engine sound and dust plumes that hung low in cold air. When the lead vehicles entered pre-sighted sectors, anti-tank guns focused on the first two machines to block the carriageway and then engaged recovery vehicles to prevent rapid clearance. The day ended with several armored hulls disabled within a few hundred meters of each other, and pioneer teams working under mortar fire to drag them aside before night froze the ground. Inside Tarnopol, the garrison timed sorties to coincide with the external push. Reserve squads moved by party wall passages to reoccupy upper floors that controlled intersections on the western arc. Mortars fired, stepped patterns to mask movement between strong points, and flak guns at street level broke up Soviet infantry that tried to close with satchel charges. Ammunition ledgers recorded accelerated expenditure. Belts for machine guns dropped to contingency levels in 2 sectors. Mortar bombs were rationed to a handful per fire mission. Flare stocks were reserved for counterattack signals and casualty evacuation. Medical stations reported a rising share of blast injuries from overhead masonry as heavier calibers entered the Soviet plan. Soviet command answered by rebalancing fire priorities. Several artillery groups shifted from urban suppression to counter-relief, concentrating 122mm and 152mm howitzers on road bends, where a disabled vehicle would obstruct both lanes. Rocket launcher battalions delivered night salvos against likely staging areas to force the relief force to disperse before dawn. Infantry units along the western perimeter dug new weapon pits on oblique lines to create overlapping fields of fire into the road cuts. A mobile anti-tank reserve, guns towed into position after dark, added a second belt at 300-400 meters depth to finish damage armor that tried to reverse out of kill zones. On the 13th of April, the relief column again closed the distance. The ground was firmer at first light, and pioneers cleared 2 narrow gaps through mixed mines and road craters. Assault guns engaged from short halts, firing high explosive into suspected gun pits while smoke shells screened recovery crews. The garrison reported hearing tank engines within a few kilometers and requested a coordinated breakout by 2 companies toward a designated landmark on the western edge. Soviet signals noted a surge in German radio traffic and increased harassing fire along interior streets, indicators that a link-up attempt was imminent. Artillery shifted to interdiction of the inner road grid to break timing between internal sorties and the external push. The largest urban assaults began on 14 or 15th April. Soviet infantry, organized in assault detachments with sappers and flamethrowers, entered along the Seret Loop and from the southeast, using smoke and direct fire from regimental guns to suppress strongpoints. Bangalore torpedoes opened lanes through wire and debris. Satchel charges collapsed interior walls to avoid exposed street crossings. Where defenders held upper floors, assault groups advanced by stairwells. Only after demolition, crews had blasted alternate passages at mid-levels to reduce exposure at landings. Machine guns were sighted to fire along corridors. Snipers were tasked to deny rooftop observation that had previously enabled accurate German mortar fires. German defense shifted to depth and economy. Strong points in pairs created interlocking fields across parallel streets, and counterattacks were sized to retake a single building, or to stabilize a corner rather than to restore earlier perimeters. Anti-tank guns retained for short-range ambushes engaged Soviet armor that probed beyond the first intersection. Where guns were lost, flak pieces at ground level substituted with armor-piercing and high-explosive. Demolitions on inner bridges and riverbank ramps were prepared for firing if Soviet infantry gained a continuous foothold across the river loop. Reports from medical stations recorded higher proportions of burns and smoke inhalation during these days, a result of close-in fights with flamethrowers and fires spreading through timber interiors after detonations. Civilians inside the city experienced the peak as a near-total loss of mobility. Water collection windows were narrowed to minutes. Bread issue points shifted location without public notice to avoid patterning. Cellar overcrowding led to shortages of air and increased sickness. Burial parties worked at night in courtyards and along interior lanes, often returning to the same sites after renewed shelling. In several blocks, municipal workers under garrison supervision cleared debris solely to open stretcher routes. Outside the ring, displaced residents from nearby villages continued to arrive at Soviet checkpoints, where they were screened, questioned about interior layouts and basement connections, and directed to rear areas under guard. On the afternoon of 15th of April, the Fortress Command reported that ammunition in 2 sectors had fallen to emergency holdings, and that several machine guns were now fed by mixed belts assembled from different lots. Requests for air resupply could not be met at scale due to weather and the lack of a suitable drop zone free of overhead fires. The relief force attempted one more thrust at dusk, using the brief freeze to pull 2 disabled hulls clear of a bend and to nose a wedge forward under smoke. Soviet artillery replied with timed concentrations on the approach and on the inner streets to prevent a breakout from meeting the external column. When night fell, the road held by the relief group remained beyond small arms range of the city, and the garrison withdrew remaining mobile reserves into a reduced inner ring. Command decisions followed quickly. German headquarters outside Tarnopol weighed another attempt against reports of armor losses and bridge conditions to the west. Staff concluded that further progress without additional tanks and bridging equipment risked immobilizing the force. Inside the city, demolition tables for interior crossings were executed in stages to slow Soviet movement, block by block. Soviet command, reading the relief failure and the ammunition, state inferred from reduced mortar activity, authorized continuous pressure through the night into 16th of April, rotating assault detachments to maintain contact and prevent reorganization. By the evening of 16th of April, the geometry established at the height of the campaign was fixed. Relief had approached to within a few kilometers, but could not force a corridor through layered mine belts and pre-sighted anti-tank fire. The garrison held an inner core with shrinking stocks and fewer heavy weapons. Soviet units maintained a closed ring and held multiple footholds in contiguous blocks along the river loop and the southeastern districts. Losses on both sides included armor disabled on approach roads, guns destroyed in direct fire duels, and assault detachments reduced in strength after repeated entries. Civilians remained in cellars with minimal services. The largest operations had been committed. Decisions in the following days would turn less on maneuver and more on endurance inside a steadily contracting perimeter. Resistance and adaptation defined the next phase as the perimeter tightened after 16th of April. Inside Tarnopol, the garrison restructured for depth rather than breadth, converting company frontages into a checkerboard of cells, 1 to 2 blocks wide. Each cell held a light machine gun team, riflemen with rifle grenades, a 2-man Panzerfaust pair where available, and a runner with fixed routes through party walls and basements. Field kitchens were pulled back to vault cellars and fed fighting positions by handcarts at night. Ammunition control centralized even further. Sector sergeants signed for belts and mortar bombs in small lots to prevent local surpluses that could not be shifted under fire. Medical posts adopted 2-tier triage to conserve resources. Walking wounded received binding and sulfamide and rejoined line duties. Surgery tables were reserved for abdominal and chest wounds, with a prospect of survival under limited plasma. German engineers emphasized improvisation. Where PAC-40s had been destroyed, flak 20mm to 37mm pieces were dug down behind blasted facades to lower their silhouette and tasked to sweep street levels with short, angular bursts. Rail sections were embedded into doorways and stairwells to resist satchel charges. Sand and brick filled improvised gabions at window height to absorb small arms and fragments. Communication relied increasingly on mouse holes cut through walls, color-coded chalk marks for direction, and cord pulls to open or close curtains over firing slits without exposing a head. 2 sewer routes were surveyed for movement of messengers and small stocks of ammunition. Use remained limited due to collapses in gas. Soviet formations adapted methodically to this layered defense. Assault detachments were reorganized to standard packages, sappers with bangalores and charges, submachine gun groups for room clearing, light machine guns to pin windows, and a flamethrower team to break basement holds. Where the first intersection proved lethal to armor, direct fire support shifted to regimental guns and self-propelled pieces firing from defilade into upper stories and roof lines to suppress observers who had been guiding mortar fire. Artillery observers moved to forward flats under cover of smoke and used pre-numbered target boards so that replacement observers could take over a mission without recalculating from map references if a building changed hands. Resource management dictated tempo. German daily rations were cut again, with combat troops prioritized for hot food once every 24 hours and others placed on cold issue. Water was rationed by sector to reduce movement above ground. The garrison's flare stocks, previously used for counterattack signals, were conserved for medical evacuation marking and final defensive fires. On the Soviet side, ammunition expenditure for 76mm and 122mm guns was trimmed during daylight to hold reserves for evening counter-relief risk windows. Smoke allotments increased to maintain mobility between captured blocks as defenders used flak and machine guns for crossing fires. Counterattacks continued but narrowed in scope. Instead of attempting to restore full sectors, 2 German squads would concentrate on a single staircase or a courtyard gate that controlled lateral movement between Soviet footholds. Success was measured in hours of delay and the recovery of wounded rather than in regained streets. Where Panzerfausts were available, teams waited for armor to nose beyond a corner and engaged at tens of meters. In several cases, destroyed vehicles were repurposed as barriers, chained by running gear to light poles to prevent bulldozing. Soviet sappers answered by blasting passage holes at mid-floor height, avoiding street level altogether when debris formed predictable kill zones. Psychological measures appeared on both sides. The garrison restricted radio loudspeakers to short announcements to minimize the effect of rumors, and maintained a routine of roll calls even when numbers fell, providing a consistent structure to the day. Soviet units posted, captured street plans at company posts, and marked cleared buildings with chalk symbols to reduce uncertainty for relieving platoons. Civilians were drawn into these routines. Water collection occurred under escort at fixed minutes after the hour. Distribution of bread and salt was shifted randomly by sector to prevent crowding at shell-prone locations. Reports from aid stations noted fatigue, dehydration, and respiratory illness in overcrowded cellars. Municipal workers prioritized clearing vents and maintaining a minimum of air circulation where possible. Intelligence collection adapted as well. Soviet patrols questioned displaced residents and laborers about wall thickness, basement corridors, and whether certain courtyards connected under arches. Details were cross-checked with aerial imagery, showing roofline damage and fires. German defenders used observation from church towers and attics as long as possible, then transitioned to periscopes and loopholes at second-story height, accepting reduced field of view for survivability. Telephone lines inside the city were spliced repeatedly with whatever wire could be recovered. Where wire failed, runners traveled pre-arranged loops timed in minutes so that commanders could infer changes if a runner did not appear when expected. Partisan and rear area actors remained peripheral, but not irrelevant. Soviet liaison officers interfaced with small partisan groups east of the city to monitor secondary roads and to report on depots and staging points that relief columns might use. Their principal contribution during this phase was time of movement and road state rather than direct combat. German rear area security units west of Tarnopol screened villages for partisans and kept local carts and draft animals available for short-haul transport to the relief-forming points. The interaction did not alter the tactical fight in the streets, but it influenced how quickly either side could move ammunition to the critical arcs where decisions would be made. Innovation also took the form of minor technical changes. Soviet infantry began carrying short ladders and hooks to traverse interior gaps when staircases had collapsed, an adaptation that sped movement between floors without returning to exposed courtyards. For close reduction of strongpoints, assault groups increased the use of pole charges against cellar doors that had resisted satchels. German defenders, short of mortar bombs, adapted rifle grenade launchers for indirect fire into captured courtyards and used timed fuses set after short drills to avoid live testing under fire. Where illumination flares were scarce, tins filled with fuel and rags were lit and kicked across lanes as improvised light sources moments before sorties. Morale ebbed and recovered in cycles shaped by logistics and tactical results. For the garrison, re-establishing a firing position or clearing a route for stretcher cases provided a measurable objective that offset the knowledge of shrinking stocks. For Soviet units, adding a contiguous building to a foothold and holding it through a night rotation served a similar function. Both commands recognized the psychological effect of stable routines. Daily ammunition counts, timed ration issues, scheduled relief of frontline squads. Messages from higher headquarters referenced the wider front sparingly. Emphasis remained on map squares, hours, and tasks that could be verified by the next report. By 18th of April, resistance and adaptation had produced a stable but contracting geometry. German cells still contested stairwells, landings, and short street segments with disciplined fires and timed counterattacks, but each action consumed irreplaceable stocks. Soviet detachments had refined a repeatable method to enter, clear, and hold successive blocks with lower exposure at the first intersections. The ring outside remained closed, the relief force remained short of the perimeter, and the contest inside the city turned on whether the defenders could maintain coherence as ammunition thinned, and whether the attackers could keep the pace of methodical reduction without diverting excessive artillery to counter expected, but diminishing attempts at breakout. The turning point arrived between 16 and 17 April 1944, when the internal geometry of defense in Tarnopol could no longer absorb losses, and the external relief could no longer force a corridor. The sequence began on the evening of 16th April, after a day of pressure along the Seret Loop and the southeastern districts. Soviet assault detachments, having rehearsed a repeatable entry method, executed simultaneous breaches on 3 streets rather than 1, using smoke to mask sappers at doorways and mid-floor charges to bypass mined stairwells. Regimental guns provided direct fire from defilade into upper stories to disrupt observers who had previously adjusted German mortar fire with accuracy. The aim was not immediate capture of the city center, but the creation of 2 wedges that would sever lateral movement between western and southern cells. Inside the fortress, the garrison attempted to reconstitute an inner line along surviving masonry blocks and a reduced bridgehead over the river loops. Ammunition discipline that had sustained short counterattacks earlier in April now collided with arithmetic. Machine gun belts in several sectors were reduced to mixed lots assembled from different calibers and years. Mortar bombs were counted in single digits per tube. Panzerfausts were husbanded for only the highest payoff targets. Demolition tables for interior crossings were partially executed to slow pursuit, but each charge fired also limited the garrison's own ability to shift reserves. Communication degraded as runners used longer party wall routes to circumvent collapsed stair cores. Medical stations reported that plasma and anesthesia were down to minimums, forcing triage toward dressings and immobilization rather than surgery. Shortly after midnight on 17th of April, 60th Army tightened the ring in a timed sequence. artillery groups shifted from counter-relief missions to urban suppression for 2 hours, marking suspected mortar nests and flak positions, with salvos from 122mm and 152mm howitzers. Rocket launcher battalions delivered short-night barrages against crossroads that had functioned as internal transfer points for the garrison. When fire lifted, assault groups advanced by interior courtyards. In 2 sectors, sappers blasted new passages at mid-floor height to link cleared buildings, allowing infantry to cross above street level, where flak guns and machine guns had maintained lethal zones. By 02.00, Soviet reports logged footholds contiguous enough to split the western arc from the southern sectors. German staff answered with their last significant reserve. 2 companies were committed to a counterattack aimed at reopening the corridor between the split sectors and pushing a feeler toward the western edge where the relief force had halted the previous evening. Mortars fired stepped patterns despite scarcity. Flak pieces at ground level swept crossing points as before. The counterattack recovered 1 stairwell and a courtyard gate, but stalled when demolition, smoke, and secondary collapses isolated the leading squads. The time bought allowed evacuation of wounded from 2 cellars and removal of documents from a sector command post, but it did not restore a continuous line. At first light on 17th of April, Soviet artillery resumed concentration on the road lattice outside the city to preclude any renewed thrust by armor. The relief group, reporting vehicle losses and the impossibility of widening the passage where disabled hulls still obstructed bends, did not attempt a new push. With the external timetable cancelled, the fortress command faced the choice between continued static defense with rapidly diminishing stocks or a breakout attempt with small, coordinated columns. Orders framed an interior regrouping toward the city center and a reconnaissance of routes for a night exfiltration along the shortest path to German lines west of Tarnopol. The decisive breach occurred late on the 17th of April in the southeastern district when an assault detachment linked 2 previously separate footholds and opened a route to the riverbank. Engineers emplaced bridges of boards across interior gaps and used ladders to traverse collapsed floors. A regimental gun, brought forward under smoke, knocked out a flak piece that had dominated a street crossing for days. This opened a lane for infantry to occupy the opposite block and to fire along the backing of a second street, removing the last direct path between the southern and western cells. With sectors now isolated, German commanders ordered destruction of additional bridges and ramps to prevent immediate exploitation. But the fragmentation could not be reversed without mobile reserves that no longer existed. Civilian conditions intersected with the turning point. Overcrowded cellars in the affected quarters were instructed to assemble for movement when front lines passed their doors. Garrison orders directed civilians toward designated basements to avoid crossing fires, then toward interior assembly points as sectors collapsed. On the Soviet side, liaison officers escorted groups to collection areas for screening, assigning labor details for debris clearance and stretcher routes once blocks were secured. These flows, though secondary to the combat, consumed time and constrained the pace of final reduction. News of the external situation reached the fortress staff late on 17th of April with clarity. No immediate armor would approach the perimeter. The commander, whose presence had anchored coordination in earlier phases, was reported killed near a sector command post during artillery concentrations. Leadership shifted to senior staff officers and company commanders who already carried tactical burdens. The absence of a single authority with citywide perspective further reduced the capacity to synchronize counterattacks or a breakout. During the night of 17-18 April, small groups attempted to exit under cover of darkness. Routes followed party walls to the edge of the built-up area, then ditches and hedgerows where mines and artillery registration were known to be sparse. Several groups were scattered by flares and bursts from perimeter posts. A minority reached fields beyond small arms range. Counts compiled after the operation by both sides helped define the scale. The garrison at its peak had totaled roughly 4,600 men. Contemporary Soviet tallies and later German returns converge on the conclusion that a very small fraction escaped. Depending on the source, approximately 55 to 80 men reached German lines in the following days. The remainder were killed or captured in and around the city. These numbers align with prisoner columns observed leaving the inner districts on 18th of April and the dead recorded at aid stations and in courtyards. Soviet units treated the fragmentation as the signal to move from methodical breach to continuous pressure. Assault detachments were rotated without pause to prevent the reconstitution of cells. Artillery shortened minimum ranges to engage across streets and into ground floors. Heavy guns shifted to counter-battery, only when persistent mortar positions were detected. By midday on 18th of April, surviving German elements were compressed into several disconnected pockets around major masonry complexes. Casualty evacuation within the garrison was now limited to dragging wounded into back rooms or cellars as corridors came under enfilade. The operational repercussions went beyond the city limits, with Tarnopol no longer requiring a large share of anti-armor artillery in the west. 60th Army could prepare to reallocate guns for operations toward the Lviv approaches. For German command, the failed relief and the destruction of the fortress garrison removed a planned anchor for a new line in eastern Galicia and forced re-evaluation of where to commit remaining armor in the sector. Civilians encountered the immediate consequences in the form of screening, requisition of labor for debris clearance, and movement to temporary shelters as combat shifted past their quarters. By the evening of 18th of April, the turning point had produced irreversible conditions. Relief had ceased. The garrison had lost a continuous defensive scheme and senior command. Soviet forces held linked footholds across multiple districts and could compress the remaining pockets at will. The transition from a contested siege to a collapsing defense set the parameters for the end of organized resistance inside Tarnopol and framed the immediate humanitarian and administrative problems that would follow capture. Organized resistance inside Tarnopol ended in the morning hours of 18th of April 1944, when remaining German pockets were compressed into isolated buildings without ammunition for sustained fire. Assault detachments cleared the final strong points with charges and close-range small arms, while artillery lifted to counter-battery and interdiction tasks on the western approaches. The city changed hands as an operational objective first and a physical space second. Headquarters of 60th Army reported the fortress neutralized. Engineer and railway troops received immediate orders to survey bridges, culverts, and rail yards. NKVD and Army Field Security detachments assumed responsibility for screening prisoners and civilians. Mopping up skirmishes continued for parts of 19th of April as sappers uncovered booby traps in stairwells and basements, but the front shifted west almost as soon as the last strong point fell. Withdrawals and regrouping outside the city followed quickly, the German relief group having failed to open a corridor and reporting armor losses and blocked bends on the approach road, pulled back toward assembly areas near Zborov and Brody on 18th-19th April. Pioneers destroyed temporary repairs on several bridges to slow pursuit. Radio traffic indicated a short-lived attempt to form a new blocking line east of Brody before reports from Army-level headquarters redirected surviving armor to other threatened sectors. On the Soviet side, artillery groups that had anchored the anti-armor belts on the Western Arc were reassigned in batteries and battalions to support advances toward the Lviv approaches. Only a residue of medium guns remained to deter any renewed thrust toward Tarnopol. Prisoners and stragglers defined the military aftermath. The fortress garrison had totaled roughly 4,600 personnel at its peak. Contemporary Soviet tallies and post-war German returns converge on a narrow band for survivors who reached German lines. Approximately 55 to 80 men. The remainder were killed in the city and its immediate environs or taken prisoner during the final 2 days. Captured personnel included a mix of Army infantry, police, Luftwaffe flak detachments, and service troops reorganized as ad hoc battle groups. Processing points were established at former municipal buildings. Initial inventories recorded small arms, a reduced number of machine guns, and scattered anti-tank weapons, with many rendered unusable by demolition or lack of ammunition. Soviet medical units and field security teams separated wounded from able-bodied prisoners and documented ranks, units, and serial numbers before transfers to rear camps. Civilian consequences were immediate and layered: bombardment, Demolitions and fires had destroyed or damaged significant portions of the built-up area, especially along the Seret Loop and the southeastern districts that had seen repeated assault and counterattack. Overcrowded cellars emptied into streets marked by rubble, uncollected bodies, and blocked water points. Army Medical Services established triage stations for civilians with blast injuries, burns, and fractures. Priority went to cases with high probability of survival under limited supplies. Municipal functions reconstituted under a military commandantura. Water distribution points were reopened under guard. Debris clearance teams, drawn from local labor lists and prisoner details, cleared main corridors for stretcher movement and vehicle access. Sanitation squads addressed latrine pits and carcass removal to reduce disease risk. Registration of residents began within 48 hours for rationing and curfew control. Screening procedures reflected security priorities. NKVD and SMERSH officers conducted identity checks at collection points, compared names with pre-compiled lists, and detained individuals suspected of collaboration, service in occupation-era police units, or participation in nationalist underground networks. Men of military age were examined for draft eligibility. Some were mobilized for labor or rear area units after medical inspection. These measures occurred alongside humanitarian tasks and were documented in parallel systems: military police logs for detentions, civil registers for housing and rations, each with separate reporting lines. The dual track meant that not all family members reappeared together after screening, a pattern recorded in local testimonies and administrative notes. Immediate reconstruction focused on transport. Railway troops surveyed the marshalling yard, rail spurs, and overpasses. Teams replaced rails lifted during the investment and shored embankments cratered by artillery. Temporary decking restored limited load capacity to key bridges, enabling ambulances and ammunition trucks to pass. Road engineers filled craters with rubble and timber, and reopened the principal east-west and north-south corridors through the town. By the third day, light trains could run short distances for supply transfer, though speeds were restricted and traffic was interrupted whenever sappers uncovered additional mines. The goal was not full urban restoration, but restoration of throughput, sufficient for the front's logistical needs. Burial and identification proceeded under pressure. Military and municipal teams collected bodies from courtyards, stairwells, and streets. Lists were compiled where documents or recognizable uniforms allowed. Many dead were interred in temporary graves near the places they fell, to be consolidated later. The process was complicated by continued detonations from delayed action charges, and by the condition of buildings that threatened secondary collapse. For families, the immediate problem was notification and the retrieval of personal effects. For the commandantura, the priority was public health and the removal of obstacles that interfered with vehicle movement. German narratives of the withdrawal framed the loss of the fortress within the wider crisis in eastern Galicia. After-action reports from relief units described mine density, pre-sighted anti-tank fires at bends, and disabled hulls that constricted roadways. Staff conclusions emphasized the impossibility of forcing a corridor without additional armor and bridging equipment that higher headquarters had diverted to larger formations at risk of encirclement. Orders issued after 19 April redistributed remaining tanks and assault guns to sectors judged essential for holding the approaches to Brody and Lviv. The fortress garrison's destruction thus removed an intended anchor for a new line, rather than altering the near-term allocations of mobile reserves. Soviet summaries treated the capture of Tarnopol as both an operational step and a practical demonstration of methods. Reports highlighted the phase sequence, encirclement, isolation of sectors, and methodical reduction, alongside the use of artillery to interdict relief and to suppress urban strongpoints without relying exclusively on area bombardment. Loss accounting registered infantry casualties concentrated in assault detachments, with peaks during the 14 and 17 April period when breaches were forced on 3 axes. Material captured was listed in standard categories: small arms, machine guns, mortars, and the remnants of flak and anti-tank pieces. A portion was deemed unserviceable and slated for scrap. Population movement followed the front. Displaced residents from outlying villages who had sheltered near the ring entered the city for news and assistance. Others departed west with the ebb of German formations, creating mixed flows that complicated registration. Curfew and pass systems aimed to stabilize the situation. Civilians were permitted to move within assigned districts during fixed hours for water and rations. Travel between districts required authorization. Schools and churches that had survived structurally were inspected for use as temporary shelters or distribution points. Those with damaged roofs were closed until shored. Within a week, the line of contact had moved beyond Tarnopol far enough that the city's role reverted to that of a rear node, a place to stage engineer detachments, hospital trains, and supply convoys. The military commandantura maintained security and rationing, while civil authorities began longer-term assessments of housing stock, utilities, and labor needs. Documentation recorded the extent of damage, block by block, though exact civilian casualty figures remained uncertain given the overlapping phases of bombardment, street fighting, and the final collapse of the defense. For individuals who had fought or sheltered there, the withdrawal and aftermath were measured in practical terms: the location of relatives after screening, the availability of bread and water, the reopening of a single bridge that shortened the route to a hospital. For command levels on both sides, Tarnopol was a data point folded into operational planning, the elimination of a fortress that had briefly fixed attention and resources, and a cleared junction that could now support the next phase of the campaign moving west. The siege had ended not with a negotiated surrender, but with compression, capture, and the rapid translation of a battlefield into a logistics corridor under new authority. Legacy formed along several tracks that extended beyond April 1944, linking an operational episode to policy, doctrine, and the later shape of the city. For German command, Tarnopol measured the practical limits of the fortress policy in open country, without continuous natural obstacles. The garrison of roughly 4,600 men had fixed Soviet attention for several weeks, and delayed the use of a rail junction. But the cost included near total loss of the defenders, and the diversion of a relief group that could not alter the larger situation. After-action reviews noted the constraint that a single raised road with load-bearing bridges imposed on armored columns, the vulnerability of recovery vehicles in pre-sighted kill zones, and the arithmetic of ammunition in a sealed urban area. Staff conclusions circulated in Army and Corps headquarters cautioned against designating additional Fester Platz positions, where terrain offered little depth, especially when armored strength had to be rationed among crises such as Kovel, the Kamenets-Podilsky breakout, and the later defense of the Brody Corridor. For the Red Army, the siege offered a case study in a sequence that would reappear in the summer operations toward Lviv and the Vistula. The method, rapid encirclement, systematic interdiction of relief, and staged urban reduction with sappers, direct fire guns, and controlled artillery concentrations, reinforced existing doctrine. Reports from 60th Army emphasized the payoff from holding heavy guns for counter-relief, rather than committing them early to area bombardment, the utility of mid-floor breaches to bypass mined stairwells, and the effect of synchronized entries on 2 or 3 axes. Logistics notes recorded ammunition expenditure rates for 76 mm, 122 mm, and 152 mm calibers in urban reduction, and the turnaround times for bridging parks and rocket launcher battalions, when weather oscillated between freeze and thaw. These data points informed planning for the July operations, when several fortress cities and prepared localities stood on the approaches to Lviv and on the Bug and San rivers. At the operational level, the capture of Tarnopol removed one intended anchor for a German line in eastern Galicia. The relief group's withdrawal on 1819's April, and the reallocation of its surviving tanks and assault guns to the Brody and Lviv sectors reflected a shift from attempting to hold isolated junctions to preserving mobility for larger formations. For First Ukrainian Front, the city's fall allowed redeployment of artillery and engineers westward, and confirmed that rail and road repair could restore throughput within days to a node badly damaged by shelling and demolitions. The episode therefore contributed to the cumulative pressure that, by midsummer would produce the encirclement of German forces near Brody and the opening of the Lviv-Sandomierz operation. Civilian and urban legacies were immediate and long-term. In April 1944, the population faced a layered aftermath: screening by field security organs, ration registration, and the restoration of basic services under a military commandantura. Damage patterns mapped during the first weeks after capture showed heavy destruction along the Seret Loop, the southeastern districts, and the marshalling yard environs where repeated assaults and counterattacks had intersected. Post-war reconstruction replaced many masonry blocks with buildings of later style and plan. Several streets were realigned to widen corridors that had been choke points during the fighting. Bridges received permanent structures after temporary decking supported early traffic. The rail junction resumed its role in regional logistics, though with altered schedules and freight priorities as the front moved west. Demography shifted under wartime and post-war policies. The Jewish community, which had formed a significant component of the pre-war town, had already been almost entirely destroyed during the occupation years that preceded March-April 1944. Polish and Ukrainian residents who remained in 1944 experienced the crossover from German to Soviet authority, with divergent outcomes. Some were mobilized or employed in reconstruction. Others were detained for collaboration investigations or for links to underground networks. In the following year, population transfers and arrests changed the composition of the city. These processes were documented in separate administrative series: ration lists, housing registers, and security files, leaving a record of names and addresses, but not always a full account of individual fates. Military memory developed within national frameworks that used different terminology and emphasis. Soviet and later Ukrainian narratives situated Tarnopol within the liberation of Western Ukrainian territories and the route to Lviv, highlighting the role of 60th Army and the reduction of a designated fortress. German accounts integrated the episode into assessments of the 1944 retreats in Ukraine and Galicia, the allocation of 2I SS Panzer Corps to the Kamenets-Podilsky breakout rather than to fortress relief, and the later battles that culminated near Brody. Both corpuses tracked similar tactical features: mine density on approach roads, the effect of pre-sighted anti-tank fire at bends, and the attrition of mortar ammunition inside the city, but drew different lessons about whether the fortress order served strategic ends when mobile forces were insufficient. Commemoration and urban markers reflected these divides and later convergences. Mass graves and military cemeteries recorded the dead from both sides, with relocations and re-identifications occurring during successive decades as reconstruction disturbed earlier burial sites. Plaques and monuments reference the dates of fighting and the formations involved. Post-independence, local memory practices incorporated broader regional histories and focused on the wartime sequence without adopting the language of triumph or defeat beyond factual markers of units, dates, and locations. Archival work continued to refine lists of civilian casualties and to correlate prisoner roles with family records. Assessment of the fortress policy's efficacy cites Tarnopol as an example where a stand fixed enemy artillery and infantry for a finite period, but did not alter the larger distribution of force. The garrison prevented immediate Soviet use of a junction and compelled the diversion of siege resources and anti-armor belts. Yet it consumed trained personnel and equipment that could not be replaced at the same rate and required relief attempts that suffered predictable losses on constrained roads. The outcome? Measured in the ratio of defenders who escaped, approximately 55 to 80, to the original strength, informed later German decisions about where to declare fortress stands and where to trade space for time along more defensible terrain. For contemporary study, the siege provides a compact data set on late war urban operations. It illustrates how artillery, engineers, and infantry could be sequenced to minimize exposure at the first intersections, how defenders could prolong resistance by converting blocks into cells rather than contiguous fronts, and how external relief had to solve geometry as well as firepower. It also offers material for civilian impact analysis, the speed at which water and ration distribution could be reestablished, the interaction between screening and humanitarian measures, and the timelines for debris clearance to reopen medical routes. Finally, the city's post-war trajectory shows how a battlefield re-enters everyday geography. Within weeks, Tarnopol resumed the functions of a rail and road node. Within years, reconstructed quarters replaced the damaged grid with altered alignments that reduced some of the choke points that had shaped the 1944 fight. The legacy, therefore, combines a tactical lesson set, an administrative record of transition, and an urban map on which the traces of the siege persist in bridge locations, street widths, and the placement of memorial sites.